In 2017, a hashtag basically broke the internet.
It really did, yeah.
But what the internet didn't actually see was the decade of quiet, meticulous architectural planning that went into that hashtag.
Right, the real foundation.
Exactly. A blueprint that was designed to completely dismantle the invisible power structures of the modern workplace. Welcome to the deep dive.
Glad to be here.
You know, it is just fascinating how we navigate our daily professional lives. Like, you walk into your office or a hospital or a university campus, and you immediately understand the physical architecture of the place.
Oh, sure. You know where the break room is.
Right. You know where your desk is, you know which door leads to the executive suite. But today, we are going after the invisible architecture.
The unspoken rules.
Yes, the underlying unspoken rules of authority, deference, and really vulnerability that dictate how everyone in that building actually interacts. So, our mission today is to explore an incredibly comprehensive source document analyzing Me Too. Not as not just as a fleeting cultural moment, but as a massive structural turning point.
Which is such an important distinction to make.
It is, because whether you are sitting in a corporate boardroom right now or, doing rounds in a medical clinic or pulling an all-nighter in a university lab, the invisible power dynamics around you have been fundamentally rewritten over the last decade.
They really have.
And we are going to explore exactly how and why that systemic recalibration actually happened.
Because that invisible architecture you just mentioned, that is the exact target of this structural shift.
Yeah.
We so often think of workplace rules as these, static, boring compliance manuals just gathering dust on some HR shelf.
Right, the stuff you skip through during orientation.
Exactly. But the analysis we are exploring reveals that the actual foundations of professional environments have been shifting massively beneath our feet. We are transitioning from a historical system that was essentially designed to protect institutional reputation at all costs.
Which was the standard for decades.
Decades, yes. To a new system that is being legally and culturally forced to prioritize accountability and equity. It is not just, a change in the cultural mood. It is a massive, tangible, structural shift in how power actually operates.
And to really understand how these modern institutions are being reshaped, we have to start by zooming out, because most of us, if asked, would probably say this all started in 2017.
Oh, absolutely. With the Harvey Weinstein revelations.
Right, the Weinstein story and the explosion of Alyssa Milano's social media posts. We all know that story. But the source material points out that if we only look at 2017, we are missing the actual foundation entirely.
Exactly. The viral explosion was the catalyst for global awareness, sure. But the architectural framework of the movement was conceptualized way back in 2006.
Almost a full decade earlier.
More than a decade, actually, by Tarana Burke. She began it as a grassroots initiative specifically designed to support marginalized survivors of abuse.
So it wasn't about hashtags at all?
Not at all. It was about community building and resource sharing long before it was ever a trending topic on social media.
Okay, let's unpack this, because the way I see it, looking at this timeline, it is like Tarana Burke spent over a decade quietly, meticulously building this incredibly sturdy foundation in the dark.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah, she was doing the heavy lifting at the grassroots level, figuring out how to actually support people who had zero systemic power. And then 2017 was like someone suddenly flipping on a massive global floodlight.
Right, the structure was already there.
Exactly. The structure was there, but suddenly the entire world could see it and use it.
What's fascinating here is how that foundation was built to target very specific systemic flaws. If you look at the architecture of the movement, it really rests on three distinct pillars, according to the text.
Okay, what are the three pillars?
The first is the exposure of structural power asymmetry. The second is the amplification of survivor voices.
Which is the part we usually see.
Right. And the third is institutional and legal reform. And it is actually that second pillar, amplifying voices, where the real structural disruption happened.
I actually want to push back on that for a second, because amplifying voices sounds great, right? But isn't that just, raising awareness? How does raising awareness actually disrupt a hard-coded structural power dynamic?
Well, because it destroys the math of isolation.
The math of isolation. What do you mean?
So for decades, institutions relied on a culture of silence. And that silence was strictly enforced through stigma and the very real threat of professional retaliation.
Right, if you speak up, you get fired.
Exactly. The system worked because victims were isolated from one another. If you are one junior employee speaking out against a powerful executive, you were just a localized problem,
A squeaky wheel.
a squeaky wheel that can be quietly fired or pushed out. But by reframing victimhood into collective advocacy, by connecting those isolated dots, the movement essentially destroyed the isolation that allowed those power asymmetries to go unchecked in the first place.
Oh, I see, because there's safety in numbers.
Precisely. When disclosure is normalized and shared, the historical reliance on professional retaliation suddenly loses its leverage. You just cannot quietly fire an entire department.
Wow, yeah. That transition from being a silent, isolated variable to becoming part of a massive collective advocacy block that changes the entire calculus of coming forward.
It completely flips the power dynamic.
And if that first pillar is about exposing, what was it, structural power asymmetry?
Yes, structural power asymmetry.
Right. There's absolutely no better test case for this than the intensely hierarchical, high-stakes worlds of medicine and academia.
Oh, without a doubt. The research really hones in on these fields because they feature extreme authority gradients.
Authority gradients.
Basically steep power imbalances. You have attending physicians holding immense unchecked power over medical trainees.
And in academia, it's the senior faculty.
Exactly. Senior faculty members who completely control the career trajectories, the grant money, and the publication access of junior researchers. It is an environment almost perfectly designed to create and sustain vulnerability.
You know, I was reading through this section on medicine and academia, and honestly, I always thought of those fields as highly standardized, objective, science-driven environments.
Most people do.
Right. But looking at the actual power dynamics, it sounds less like modern science and more like a medieval guild system.
A medieval guild system, I like that.
Yeah, like it is this intense master-apprentice dynamic. You have these trainees who have dedicated a decade of their lives. They've taken on hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt, and their entire career survival depends completely on the favor of a single senior mentor.
That is exactly what it is. And that is why the retaliation risk in these fields is just astronomically high. The barrier to reporting abuse isn't just a fear of having an awkward workplace environment.
It's way more existential than that.
Much more. It is the threat of evaluation bias. It is the subtle loss of crucial mentorship. It is being quietly blackballed from future fellowships or research grants.
Your career is basically over before it starts.
And the problem is vastly exacerbated by historical institutional failures. The text highlights things like opaque investigative procedures, where complaints just disappear into a black box.
Or HR just sweeps it under the rug.
Exactly. Insufficient disciplinary actions where a prominent researcher just gets a slap on the wrist because, well, they bring in massive grant money. And just a total lack of survivor-centered approaches overall.
So it raises this incredibly difficult question for anyone in that environment. How can a trainee safely report abuse when the person they are reporting literally holds the keys to their entire future?
Historically, they couldn't. And that is the core issue. The analysis frames this not merely as isolated incidents of bad behavior by a few bad actors, but as a form of implicit coercion that is baked right into the training environments themselves.
Baked right in, yeah. That phrase, implicit coercion, is so heavy.
It really is.
It implies that you don't even need an explicit spoken threat. The structure of the hierarchy itself is the threat. It is the quiet understanding that if you fall out of favor for whatever reason, your career is just over.
Exactly. And this realization forces a complete reassessment of what terms like medical professionalism and ethics actually mean today.
How so?
Well, if the training environment itself relies on implicit coercion, then the entire ethical framework of the profession has to be modernized. You cannot claim to have a highly ethical medical program if the power dynamics inherently prevent your trainees from speaking up about safety or abuse.
That makes perfect sense. Now, we are talking about medicine and academia here in the West as these rigid, unspoken hierarchies. But what happens when you take that exact same vulnerability and drop it into a culture where hierarchical deference isn't just a workplace norm, but a centuries-old social pillar?
Like what happened in Taiwan.
Yes, exactly.
It creates a fascinating collision of values. Between 2023 and 2024, Taiwan experienced a massive cascading wave of disclosures. And this wasn't isolated to one specific industry at all.
It went everywhere, right?
It swept rapidly across their political sphere, into their media, and deep into their academic sectors. It was a profound regional reckoning that mirrored the structural disruptions we discussed earlier.
But with different hurdles.
Yes, very unique local hurdles.
Right, because the research highlights some incredibly dense, culturally specific barriers in the region. It specifically mentions hierarchical deference and immense concerns over reputational damage.
The concept of saving face.
Exactly, saving face within professional communities. Here's where it gets really interesting. How does a movement entirely built on the premise of speaking out, making noise, and breaking the silence actually survive and succeed in a professional culture that highly values preserving reputations and maintaining strict obedience to your elders and superiors?
It is a paradox, really.
Yeah.
But it survives by bypassing the culture entirely through structural engineering.
Structural engineering. Wait, explain that.
So the Taiwan wave perfectly illustrates the third pillar of the movement we talked about earlier: institutional and legal reform.
Ah, the third pillar.
Right. You cannot just ask people to suddenly abandon a centuries-old cultural norm of deference overnight. That doesn't work.
Right. You can't just flip a switch on culture.
Exactly. If you tell a junior employee in Taiwan to just walk into their boss's office and confront them or report them to a direct superior, the cultural friction is simply too high. It violates way too many ingrained social codes.
So what is the mechanism then? How did they actually fix that?
They implemented rapid legislative refinements and institutional restructuring. Instead of relying on interpersonal confrontation, Taiwan built new, formal reporting processes that bypass the traditional cultural hierarchy entirely.
So they took the boss out of the equation.
Completely. We are talking about mandated third-party investigative channels, highly enhanced, legally enforced protections for whistleblowers. The legal frameworks essentially provided a mandatory bypass around the cultural roadblocks.
That is brilliant.
It really is. They took the burden of disrespect or rocking the boat off the individual's shoulders and placed it onto the legal compliance structure. Accountability was no longer reliant on someone's cultural comfort level. It became a matter of strict structural compliance.
So the law essentially acts as the scaffolding to support the culture while it changes. That makes so much sense. You build a bridge over the cultural barriers so the victims don't have to climb over it themselves.
Exactly, a structural bridge.
But of course, you cannot have this level of rapid global structural reform, whether in an American hospital or a Taiwanese political office, without intense friction.
Oh, absolutely not. Change always brings friction.
Right. As the movement transitioned from this massive wave of social media advocacy into actual hard-coded institutional policy, it sparked some very complex ongoing debates.
Naturally. Any systemic recalibration of this magnitude is going to generate both significant benefits and significant controversy. The analysis we're exploring is very clear in mapping out both sides of this transition.
Let's start with the benefits.
Sure. On the positive side, the structural changes have led to increased visibility and validation for survivors, greatly strengthened institutional accountability, and a measurable, tangible advancement in workplace safety and gender equity.
Okay, now this is where things get highly complex and, frankly, heavily debated.
Yes, they do.
And I want to be very clear with you listening right now. We are looking at arguments from all sides of the political and social spectrum here. Our goal today isn't to tell you who is right or wrong, or to endorse any of these viewpoints. We are strictly here to impartially map out the friction points that the source material is highlighting, just so you can understand the full scope of the ongoing conversation.
Which is crucial for a complete deep dive.
Exactly. So with that said, the analysis outlines several major ongoing debates. It mentions the very real concerns regarding false allegations, which the data carefully notes are statistically rare, but they are socially amplified and deeply devastating to the individuals involved.
They ruin lives, yes.
Right. It also discusses the vast variability in how different institutions actually respond. Like, a Fortune 500 company might handle a complaint very differently than a small independent lab.
Huge disparity there.
But the friction point that really stands out to me in the text is this intense tension between institutional due process and public accountability, which is often described as trial by media.
Yes. This raises an important question, really. Why do we see trial by media occur in the first place?
Well, because people get angry online, right?
That's part of it. But if we connect this back to the bigger picture and look at what we discussed regarding the medical and academic fields, the research points directly to the failure of internal systems.
Oh, the black box HR departments.
Exactly. When an institution's internal HR department or disciplinary board operates in total secrecy, and when there's a historical track record of powerful people receiving insufficient disciplinary action, the public naturally loses trust in those internal systems.
Yeah, makes sense.
So public accountability, or trial by media, rushes in to fill the void left by a lack of institutional trust.
I hear that, but I have to push back here. Isn't there a severe danger in that?
There definitely is.
Like, if we completely bypass institutional due process just because we assume it is broken, aren't we just replacing a flawed justice system with mob rule? Where is the line between holding a powerful person accountable and simply destroying someone's career based on an uninvestigated social media post?
That is the exact tension the analysis highlights. It is a highly volatile dynamic.
Extremely volatile.
But the mechanism behind it is key. When victims feel that the formal internal channels are fundamentally rigged to protect the powerful, they view the court of public opinion not as mob rule, but as the only remaining lever to force accountability.
The last resort.
Exactly. The tension between due process and public accountability is ultimately a symptom of institutional failure.
So it is kind of like a disconnected fire alarm.
A disconnected fire alarm.
Yeah, like the trial by media isn't necessarily the goal, it is the byproduct of a broken internal safety system. If the fire alarm in your building is disconnected and you smell smoke, you aren't going to sit quietly and wait for the building manager to fill out a form.
Of course not.
You're going to run outside and start screaming to warn people. You do whatever you have to do to be heard.
That is a brilliant way to conceptualize it. The screaming outside isn't the ideal way to handle a fire, obviously.
Right.
But it happens because the preferred systemic method failed. The public exposure, the friction, the noise, it all forces the institution to finally fix the internal alarm system.
To fix the structural architecture.
Exactly. Until institutions can prove that their internal processes are transparent, fair, and truly survivor-centered, that public friction will continue to exist as a counterbalance.
So what does this all mean? When we zoom out and look at the entirety of this analysis, the overarching conclusion is that Me Too can no longer be viewed merely as a hashtag or, a fleeting cultural moment of awareness.
Not at all.
It represents a permanent systemic recalibration. It is a transition toward what the researchers call equity-centered institutional design and ethical modernization.
Which are big terms.
Very big terms. Like equity-centered institutional design sounds great on a glossy PowerPoint presentation, but what does that actually mean for you listening right now when you walk into your office or your lab tomorrow?
It means the baseline metrics for professional survival and leadership have permanently shifted.
Shifted how?
Well, it means that organizational transparency, professional responsibility, and leadership accountability are no longer just buzzwords to be trotted out during an annual HR seminar.
The kind you sleep through.
Right. They are the new mandatory standards of daily operation. The invisible power dynamics we started our conversation with are being brought out into light, and leaders are now expected to actively manage, mitigate, and dismantle those power asymmetries.
It's an active duty now.
Yes. If you are managing a team, you are now responsible not just for their output, but for ensuring the architecture of your team doesn't rely on implicit coercion.
It truly is a paradigm shift. I mean, we have covered the timeline and the dismantling of the whisper network, the medieval guild structures of medicine, the legal scaffolding used to bypass cultural deference in Taiwan, and the intense, fiery friction of rewriting the rules of the modern workplace.
It is a lot to take in.
It is a massive amount to digest. But as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a final, lingering thought to ponder on your own. It is something that builds on everything we explored today.
I'm intrigued.
If this movement successfully dismantles these traditional, highly concentrated power hierarchies, the kind where a single senior mentor holds all the cards, all the great money, and all the power over your future, what does the new, equitable model of mentorship actually look like?
That's the real challenge.
How do high-stakes fields like medicine or academia or even corporate law safely train the next generation of experts without recreating the very power imbalances we just spent a decade trying to tear down?